We'll get started. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for coming to the town building. I'm Courtney from the Wayland Library. Tonight, we're excited to have Richard Smith here, who has lectured on and written about antebellum U.S. history and 19th century American history since 1995. He has worked in Concord as a public historian and living history interpreter for 25 years and has portrayed Henry Thoreau at Walden Pond, around the country, and in Canada. He's written 8 books for Applewood Books and is a regular contributor to Discover Concord magazine. We're excited to have him here, and thank you to the Thoreau Society and also the Mass Humanities and Mass Cultural Council for making this possible. If you're joining us on Zoom, feel free to put your questions in the chat and I will raise my hand and read them out loud analog style. And we are recording, so you'll be able to rewatch and share. Hopefully it will be also on our local cable access station, Waycam. So I'll hand it over to Richard.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, and can everybody hear me on Zoom okay, I hope?
Yeah.
So, perfect, okay. So, before we begin, since I'm gonna do something a little bit different, since we're here in Wayland, Massachusetts, I thought I would start with somebody from Wayland, Massachusetts. So today is the 223rd birthday of Liv, who's buried about a mile from here, over in the North Cemetery. And she was very aware of a lot of the issues we're going to be talking about this evening. And in fact, in 1860, she wrote her own book called The Duty of Disobedience to the Fugitive Slave Act. And in this pamphlet, which was widely published, she asked not only our legislature in Massachusetts, but the people of Massachusetts to disobey the fugitive slave law. And we're going to be covering that a little bit this evening. So I would like to dedicate this to Mrs. Child, who I said is only about a mile from here over in the North Cemetery. Civil disobedience is both a political tactic and the basis of movements that advocate social change. It is a nonviolent action engaged in by an individual or individuals who refuse to obey a law for moral or philosophical reasons. And this evening, we're going to be talking about 3 guys who did that. Henry David Thoreau, Mahatma Gandhi, and Dr. Martin Luther King. And we'll be covering over the next 40 minutes or so. But first, we're going to be starting in Concord, Massachusetts. The story is well known. July of 1846, while Concord from his Walden Pond house to have a shoe repaired, Henry Thoreau was stopped by Constable Sam Staples and asked to pay his poll tax for the year. When Thoreau refused as a protest against the Mexican War and the issue of slavery, Staples arrested the 29-year-old and put him in the Concord jail for, as Thoreau later wrote, a novel and interesting night. There's our Henry right there. These are the 3 faces of Henry Thoreau. The first picture is based on a drawing done of him in 1854. The second picture was taken in 1857. The third one was taken in 1861. It would surprise nobody in Concord that Thoreau had taken an anti-slavery stand. He did, after all, come from an abolitionist family. Since his mother and sisters were supporters of William Lloyd Garrison, it was only natural that Henry would also believe in his motto, no union with slaveholders, and this meant no paying of taxes. William Lloyd Garrison and an anti-slavery flag. Thoreau would spend one night in the Concord jail. He would be released the next morning because the tax was paid, not by him, but by someone else, probably his Aunt Maria Thoreau. He then returned to his home at the pond and went on a huckleberry picking expedition with some friends, quote, on one of our highest hills, and where the state was nowhere to be seen. There is a story that claims that Ralph Waldo Emerson visited Thoreau while he was in jail. When he saw his young friend behind bars, he asked, Henry, why are you in jail? And Thoreau cheekily replied, Waldo, why are you not in jail? You've all heard this story? Okay, well, it's not true. It never happened. In fact, Emerson knew nothing of Thoreau's arrest until the next day after Thoreau had been released, and Emerson heard about it from Bronson Alcott. For his part, Emerson would write in his journal that Thoreau's actions were, quote, mean and skulking and in bad taste. But after discussing the matter personally with Thoreau, Emerson had to admit that Thoreau's stance was stronger than most abolitionists. Quote, the abolitionists denounce the Mexican War and give much time to it, but they pay the tax, he would say in his journal. So if you've been to the center of Concord, there's a small little grassy area next to the Catholic rectory. That's where the Concord jail stood. And there's this marker that says that Henry Thoreau was imprisoned for one night right there. And because of that, he wrote the essay Civil Disobedience, which we're going to be talking about later. Because of his experience, Thoreau went on to write the essay that has become one of the most influential political works in American literature. The essay that eventually became known as Civil Disobedience went through several incarnations before it was published in 1849. Although his incarceration occurred while he was living at Walden, the lecture about his jailing was not started by Thoreau until after he left the pond in 1847. So naturally, his friends and fellow townspeople were quite curious about his night in jail and the reasons why he was arrested in the first place. Once Thoreau moved out of his Walden Pond house into the home of Ralph Waldo Emerson in October of 1847, he began working on the lecture about his jailing and the reasons behind it. On January 26, 1848, Thoreau spoke at the Concord Lyceum on the relation of the individual to the state. We don't know how the people of Concord reacted to the lecture, and the only review we have is from Bronson Alcott. In it, he wrote that Thoreau's lecture was an admirable statement, and that an attentive audience heard Henry's, quote, pertinent, well-considered, and reasoned statement. Alcott's enjoyment of the lecture is no surprise. He himself had been jailed in 1843 for not paying his taxes because he was protesting slavery. And this action, no doubt, influenced Thoreau to do the same thing 3 years later. On February 16, 1848, about a month later, Thoreau again spoke on his jailing, again before the Concord Lyceum. This time he called it the rights and duties of the individual in relation to the state. Doesn't really roll off the tongue. This was not simply a repeat of the lecture they had given 3 weeks earlier. Instead, it was probably an expanded and revised version of the earlier piece. Bronson Alcott was again in the audience at this second lecture, and he later reported to Emerson that he was satisfied over Thoreau's lecture. The following year, in the spring of 1849, Thoreau was contacted by Elizabeth Peabody and asked if he would submit his lecture for publication in her new periodical, Aesthetic Papers. Thoreau reluctantly agreed because he was working on his first book at the time, and the essay saw print for the first time in May 1849 under the title Resistance to Civil Government. The essay, much like the magazine itself, was barely noticed by any except a few of Thoreau's friends. One reviewer did say that Thoreau was crazy, and the other said if he didn't like America, he should move to France. As it turned out, this issue of Aesthetic Papers was the only issue of the magazine, and Resistance to Civil Government died a quick literary death and remained obscure in Thoreau's lifetime. I'm not really sure why this magazine bombed. Not only did it have Resistance to Civil Government by Thoreau, it also had an essay by Ralph Waldo Emerson called War, and a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne called Main Street. And yet somehow the magazine never went anywhere.
Why are some of them Esquires?
It's funny, none of them were lawyers. I think that was just trying to make them sound important. She said, why are they called Esquires? You see that a lot in the lectures of the period. They're always introduced as Henry David Thoreau Esquire. But yeah, that usually means lawyer as far as I know. But I think it just makes them sound important. After Thoreau's death in 1862, Resistance to Civil Government appeared in an 1866 collection of his writings called A Yankee in Canada with Anti-Slavery and Reform Papers. This was the first time that the lecture was published under the title Civil Disobedience, which is what we call it today. Now, it's not known who changed the title. More than likely, it was an editorial decision made by the publisher. So it's 1866. We had just gone through 4 years of resistance to civil government by the southern states. So I think that somebody at Tickner and Fields, the publisher, said, let's make it a little bit more palatable. So that's why they called it civil disobedience. Nowhere in any of Thoreau's writings or his journal does he ever mention the phrase civil disobedience. And like I said, he'd been dead for 4 years by then. So I think it was probably an editorial decision. But let's go back to the event that started all of this, Thoreau's night in jail. What exactly did it prove? What did it accomplish? Certainly the non-payment of $1.50 did not end the Mexican War, nor did it bring slavery to its knees. So why did Thoreau do it? Simply put, he thought it was the right thing to do. He came from an abolitionist family. His mother and sisters were among the founders of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1837. And as I said earlier, they were followers of William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist who called for the immediate emancipation of all slaves. His motto, no union with slaveholders, meant exactly that. In no way, shape, or form would a Garrisonian support a government that supported slavery. That meant no allegiance whatsoever to the United States government, including voting and payment of taxes. And that's why Thoreau withheld his poll tax. As he later would say in Resistance to Civil Government, I cannot consider it my government when it is the slave's government as well. Thoreau's conscience simply would not allow him to swear allegiance to any government that supported slavery. And in 1846, that government was also making war on Mexico, a war that Thoreau saw as immoral. It was, many abolitionists believed, the land grab by President Polk in order to extend slavery into those territories, which is exactly what it was. To Thoreau and the others, the extension of slavery and the Mexican War went hand in hand. As I mentioned earlier, the Massachusetts poll tax in no way supported slavery or the Mexican War. It was a local tax. But as Thoreau said in Civil Disobedience, he did not care to trace the path of his dollar. In his view, the tax supported Concord, which in turn supported Middlesex County, which in turn supported the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which in turn supported the United States of America. The United States of America condoned slavery and the Mexican War. So that's why the abolitionists, including Thoreau, are withholding their tax. And Thoreau wanted these issues to end now at whatever the cost. He said in Civil Disobedience, this people must cease to hold slaves and to make war on Mexico, though it costs them their existence as a people. Now, some people in Concord thought that Thoreau's stand was noble. Bronson Alcott said, well, as I wrote, pertinent, well considered, and reasoned. But other Concordians weren't so sure. John S. Keyes, for instance, didn't quite understand people like Alcott and Thoreau, and he called them silly would-be martyrs. Thoreau was not the first tax resistance in Concord. Brister Freeman had been enslaved in Concord, and he gained his freedom after serving in the American Revolution. Once free, Brister Freeman pooled his resources with another former slave to purchase land in Walden Woods in 1785. Exactly like Thoreau, Freeman did not pay his poll tax for 6 years, which accumulated to £7 19 shillings. So if you look at the picture of the map of Walden Pond, the red star is where Brister Freeman's property was. So town officials gave Freeman a choice. He could either sign over his property or spend time in debtor's prison. Freeman, who did odd jobs to provide for his family, decided to surrender half of his property, and on January 17, 1791, he signed over his property to the town of Concord. Nowadays, there's a big boulder right there, put there by the Walden Woods Project, marking not only where Brister Freeman had his house, but also it talks about Thoreau mentioning Brister Freeman in Walden. "50 years after Brister Freeman signed over his land in 1843, Thoreau's friend Bronson Alcott did not pay his Concord poll tax. A few months before he moved his family to the utopian experiment called Fruitlands, he was arrested for not paying the poll tax. He was arrested, but he did not spend time in jail. He was taken to the jailhouse, but the jailer wasn't there. So the constable said, okay, wait here, I'll go look for him. And he left. And Bronson's just kind of waiting outside of the jail. In the meantime, Samuel Hoare, a local attorney, heard about the arrest, and he came and he paid the poll tax on Bronson's behalf. So like Thoreau, Alcott had wanted to go to jail, but since the tax was paid, he was let go. The other picture, of course, you all know who that is. That's Bronson's famous daughter, Louisa May, somebody or other. She wrote some books. Radical abolitionist like her parents, radical feminist and suffragist like her mother in later years. But because of Civil Disobedience, the essay, many more people in the world are more familiar with Thoreau's protest than they are of Brister Freeman or Bronson Alcott. Along with Walden, it is probably Thoreau's best known work. And for the last 173 years, the essay has continued to inspire, frustrate, be debated about, and be misinterpreted. Anarchists claim it is an article about anarchy, while libertarians say it is a right-wing call to arms. And the essay, as well as Thoreau himself, has been connected to protest movements all around the world. A couple of my favorite lines: I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? These are three anarchists that read Civil Disobedience in later years, the late 19th century. Leo Tolstoy on the left, Emma Goldman in the middle, and then Voltairine de Cleyre over there on the right. They all read Thoreau, they all read Emerson, they all read William Lloyd Garrison, they all read Frederick Douglass, and this is much later in the century, 1880s, 1890s, early 20th century for both Emma Goldman and Voltairine de Cleyre. Because of people like them, the essay slowly gained popularity throughout the 20th century and has since become one of Thoreau's signature works. It was widely cited by revolutionaries such as Leo Tolstoy, Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. King, Emma Goldman, Voltairine de Cleyre, as being influential to their philosophies and their ideals. And today it is considered one of the most influential political essays in the history of American literature. But Henry Thoreau was not political. He never belonged to any political party. And as far as we know, he never voted in any election. He never even went to town meeting. How many of you go to town meeting? Yet some modern day political and philosophical groups see Thoreau as an influence. As I said earlier, anarchists claim that he was one of them, citing Civil Disobedience as proof. They say that the quote, "that government is best which governs not at all," is a call for anarchy. And all three of these people said, see, Thoreau's an anarchist. Yet Thoreau was not an anarchist. Rather, he wanted a government that would respect all individuals. To speak practically and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I ask for not at once no government, I ask for at once a better government. Still, that doesn't stop the anarchists from claiming him as one of their own. So they're on the far left. On the far right, we have the libertarians who also like Thoreau. And they have several political legs to stand on when they call him a libertarian. His views on wildness and individual freedom certainly are libertarian philosophy. His willingness to go to jail rather than pay taxes speaks to the libertarian belief that the government forcing people to pay taxes is inherently wrong. So to them, it's evident that Thoreau was one of the first libertarians. But what the anarchists and libertarians get wrong, in my humble opinion, is Thoreau's spirituality, his transcendentalism. They view his essays like Civil Disobedience and A Plea for Captain John Brown as political essays, when in reality, they are spiritual essays. Thoreau's aim was not to be left alone by the state and to do as one pleases, but to get the state as well as himself to act in concert with human and divine conscience. In fact, all of Thoreau's writings have a spiritual underpinning to them. At the core of it, civil disobedience is a call to follow one's conscience. Thoreau is searching for a connection with the divine through his conscience and trying to live in accord with all beings, great and small. Hopefully you know who this is. At an international conference in London in 1931, an American reporter asked Mohandas Gandhi, "Did you ever read an American named Henry D. Thoreau?" Gandhi replied, "Why, of course I read Thoreau. I read Walden first in Johannesburg in South Africa in 1906, and his ideas influenced me greatly. I adopted some of them and recommend the study of Thoreau to all my friends," so do I, "who are helping me in the cause of Indian independence. Why, I actually took the name of my movement from Thoreau's essay on the duty of civil disobedience, written about 80 years ago." So think of it. Here's a man from India living in South Africa. He's reading the works of this guy living in Concord, Massachusetts in the mid-19th century. Now, the reason Gandhi read Thoreau, in the late 19th century, the first English biography of Thoreau was written by a man named Henry Salt. Henry Salt belonged to a vegetarian organization in London. Another person who belonged to that organization was Gandhi. And so Salt kind of introduced Gandhi to Henry Thoreau's writings. So that's how he came to know who this guy was. In his 1942 appeal to American friends, Gandhi wrote, "You have given me a teacher in Thoreau who furnished me through his essay, Civil Disobedience, scientific confirmation of what I was doing in South Africa." Similarly, Gandhi had written to President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942 saying, "I have profited greatly by the writings of Thoreau and Emerson." Roger Baldwin, chairman of the American Civil Liberties Union, rode with Gandhi on a train trip through France in 1931, and he noticed that the only visible book was Thoreau's Civil Disobedience that Gandhi was carrying. Baldwin remarked on the extremeness of Thoreau's doctrine, and Gandhi replied that the essay, quote, "contained the essence of his political philosophy, not only as India's struggle related to the British, but as to his own views of the relation of citizens to government." In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi led a salt march to the sea. The British government taxed salt so much that the people of India could barely afford to buy it. And so Gandhi, as a protest, he led a march to the sea, 240 miles. He started out with 78 people. By the time they got to the sea, he had 60,000 people with him protesting the British tax on salt. Civil disobedience becomes a sacred duty when the state becomes lawless or corrupt. Oh, we'll talk about that later. Here he is in jail. He went to jail several times. Rather than obey unjust laws like Thoreau, he thought going to jail was a better thing to do. Here's another one of our heroes this evening. Here in this courageous New Englander's refusal to pay his taxes and his choice of jail rather than support a war that would spread slavery's territory into Mexico, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. Fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. Dr. King. He was already invested in racial justice at the point of his life when he read Civil Disobedience. But Thoreau showed him the path towards fighting for civil rights. Reflections of Thoreau's philosophy can be seen in Dr. King's activism throughout the 1960s. And he further explained the impact Thoreau had on him, saying, "I became convinced that cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Henry David Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we are the heirs of a legacy of creative protest. We are the heirs of a legacy of creative protest." The teachings of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. Indeed, they are more alive than ever before, whether expressed in a sit-in at lunch counters, a freedom ride into Mississippi, a peaceful protest in Albany, Georgia, a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. These are outgrowths of Thoreau's insistence that evil must be resisted and that no moral man can patiently adjust to injustice. Like Thoreau and Gandhi, Dr. King spent time in jail resisting the laws and institutions he saw as evil. A sit-in at a Georgia restaurant, the Montgomery bus boycott, and a demonstration in Birmingham are just a few of the nonviolent protests that contributed to Dr. King's 29 arrests. He even used his time behind bars to further his own cause. In his 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, he wrote about the need for average citizens to take action against unjust laws. Has anybody read Dr. King's letters from a Birmingham jail? Have you read Civil Disobedience? If you read both of them, they dovetail together really, really well. And think about it. Here's this guy in Concord in 1846. Here's Dr. King in 1963. They're both in jail for not wanting to obey unjust laws. They both write two of the most important political essays in American literature. The words and actions of Thoreau, Gandhi, and Dr. King continue to live on. The anti-war movement of the 1960s, the fight for women's reproductive rights, the LGBTQ movement, and Black Lives Matter, all political cultural heirs to Thoreau's essay. And that's the thing that I like to talk about in this part of my presentation. This is all very quaint. You know, Thoreau was 150 years ago. Even Dr. King, he died almost 60 years ago. Are these things that are just kind of old-fashioned? Are these things that we don't really have to pay attention to anymore? Is civil disobedience still going on? Creative protest. Creative protest. This was right after Dr. King was killed. The odd thing about assassins, Dr. King, is they think that they've killed you. And as for creative protests now, sanctuary cities are all the rage right now. A lot of places are calling themselves sanctuary cities. I just recently read a letter from a Massachusetts reverend in Worcester, Massachusetts, Thomas Wentworth Higginson. He was proud in 1850 to say that Worcester was a sanctuary for runaway slaves. And he said, Worcester to the slave is Canada. And he was willing to stand up and against any federal marshals that came into Worcester in search of fugitive slaves. This is a recent picture from about a week ago. Civil disobedience. It's still going on. There are people who still feel like it's time to stand up against an unjust government who are trying to do unjust things. Thoreau said in Civil Disobedience, there will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power from which all its own power and authority are derived and treats him accordingly. Although they don't know it, that guy in the White House and those people in Congress, they work for us. All men recognize the right of revolution. That is the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. That might be my next tattoo. So this kind of, I always figure out how do I end this talk? Because I feel personally, we're in a period right now where the government's tyranny and inefficiency are great and unendurable. And so, but it's such a downer ending a talk on that. I like to give talks where you kind of feel a little bit hopeful. So I found a good way to end it. When I despair, I remember that all through history, the way of truth and love has always won. There have been tyrants and murderers, and for a time they seem invincible, but in the end, they always fail. Think of it, always. Thank you very much. We can certainly take questions from the folks here or the folks on Zoom. How many are watching on Zoom?
18.
18. Hi, guys. Questions, folks? So I don't want to sound, like the kid, but judging by my audience, how many people here remember the 60s? Okay. Although they say if you remember the 60s, you weren't really there. But so did it seem like the world was ending? Did it seem like things were hopeless? When you're seeing the anti-war protesters on TV or people like Dr. King and others, did that give you hope?
Much more hope than it didn't seem like the end at all. It seemed quite much like the beginning.
Okay, great.
It felt to me quite different than this feels presently.
How did it feel different? Do you feel like there's hope now?
I think it takes a lot more work to
Right.
feel like there's hope now.
Right. And I always say stuff like, well, we survived Nixon. But
That's
it's,
a nickel dime.
yeah. So,
Really.
but again, as Thoreau and Dr. King and Gandhi and a lot of these other folks were saying, we are the ones with the power. We just have to kind of get up and act on it.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
For those more studied in the ways of Thoreau, how might we surmise he would consider that our government no longer serves the people on either side and serves the corporative industry?
I don't think he felt like the government of the 1840s and 1850s was serving anybody either, other than the slaveholders. So, and the warmongers in the sense of the Mexican War. So I think that he would not be surprised that we're in the kind of situation that we're in. And look, we've made great strides since Thoreau's day. We've had a Black president. We've had a Black vice president. We have people of color in Congress. We have women in Congress. We have women senators and lawyers. We have a female governor here in Massachusetts. We've got an Asian American governor of Boston. So things have certainly improved in that sense. But I think that he would say that it's kind of the same old, that we need to stand up to this government because we have to make sure that they're aware that they're serving us. And as we view it right now, they're not serving anybody but themselves. Even in one of his essays, Thoreau talks about the governor of Massachusetts at the time being a self-serving governor. And so he was aware of the people who were acting that way. Absolutely. Yes,
So a comment online, she says it seems difficult in that it isn't till much later that history judges what was simple disobedience versus a justified and moral protest.
it's true. You know, I think that when Thoreau and the other abolitionists were protesting the Mexican War, when the abolitionists were asking for immediate emancipation of the slaves, by the vast majority of Americans, they were considered troublemakers and strange. And, you know, even when the Civil War began, a lot of people blamed the abolitionists and said, if you had just shut up about all this, we wouldn't have had all these issues. You know, I grew up not far from Kent State. I was 10 years old when Kent State happened. There was a lot of people that were blaming the protesters for what happened at Kent State and not the National Guard. And it's only now, 60 years later, that we kind of look back on the anti-war movement of the Vietnam era and say, oh yeah, those kids were right. I don't know if they were considered that right when it was going on.
I did, and the people I knew did.
Of course. Right, and I'm kind of preaching to the choir here, I think.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, certainly, and I agree, but not in my household where I grew up. It was the hippies were the trouble. They were the problem. So, you know, it may take a while. That's what I'm afraid of. That 50 years from now, what are our ancestors going to say about this period in history? You know, this year is the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, the beginning of the American Revolution. Has our country, are we only going to be 250 years old? You know, what are they going to say in another 50 years when they're celebrating the 300th anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord? So yeah, when Dr. King was killed, not everybody was sad. When Gandhi was killed, not everybody was sad. So yeah, it takes a while for history to judge these people and to put them on the pedestal that we put them on now, I think.
One more comment. She says, the 60s taught me that we're all connected and working together, cooperating instead of competition is perhaps our way out.
I agree. We need to be united somehow. The 60s did teach us that. And for me, the 1860s taught me that. The country was literally torn apart. And it took a civil war to kind of unite us, reunite us. And so she's exactly right. We are all connected. That person sounds like a transcendentalist. But you're exactly right. We need to all come together. But
So was the rock.
absolutely. But you know, like you kind of hinted at, we're all kind of in our own little echo chambers here. You know, I would love to give this talk to people who are not necessarily agreeing with what I have to say, so that they can hear and see all this stuff. You know, the other side's in their echo chambers. They've got their television stations, they've got their newspapers, they've got their news, we've got ours. So
What would happen if we all just didn't pay our taxes?
what would happen if we didn't all pay our taxes? I don't know, let's find out. Yeah,
I feel that, well, I feel that the stakes are higher these days because in terms of global impact. You know, I mean, you know, I know India was dealing with the British and all that, but I think there's so many global issues that really make the risks so much higher, and also make it more, I think, make individuals feel more helpless. Because it's one thing if you're talking about your own government, but you know, all governments these days are on the world stage, and we're all intertwined, our economies, the environmental stuff. And I just think it makes it so much harder to hope, because it's not just your little American.
well, see, that's the
government.
problem with the America First people, is they either choose to ignore that fact or they don't care. You know, you can't, and it's much more than it was in Thoreau's time. Absolutely. You know, but we learned during World War I Woodrow Wilson learned that you can't be an isolationist in the modern world. You know, he ran for a second term saying, I'll keep us out of the Great War. You know, that was his slogan. He kept us out of war. Well, less than a year later, we were in the war because he realized that what's going on over in Europe is going to affect everybody. And it's even more so now. You know, I mean, thanks to things like Zoom, you know, we're all way more connected. And I think that's what we have to realize. And I think a lot of us do, but a lot of people don't. You know, who cares what goes on in Gaza? Or who cares what happens over in Greenland or wherever, you know? But yeah, because if one country is having issues, then we're all going to have, a lot of us are going to have those issues. Look at Ukraine. You know, I was really heartened by all the countries that stood up to protect Ukraine because they are all aware that we are connected.
European countries. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes.
It does seem to me that whether we're talking about Thoreau's time and the struggles that culminated in the Civil War, or we're talking about the 60s and the anti-war protests and the movement for civil rights, however opposed the sides were, they were both working within the context of a shared assumption about government and its function.
Right.
And what's profoundly different and I think uniquely challenging right now is that the two sides fighting have enabled the ascendancy of people whose objective is the elimination of that governmental context entirely for their own benefit. So that I would love to hear what Thoreau had to say about when it's not just a matter of refusing to pay your poll tax and going to jail. It's a matter of having no jails, it's a matter of having no government. Or the civil rights movement, it's about not being able to change the law because there is no law. And so I think that that's something that bears a lot of thought as we try to find our place in navigating the current situation.
Well, say what you will about, I mean, there have been so many presidents over the years, at least in my lifetime, that we've demonized over the years, Nixon just being one of them. But say what you will about Nixon, at least he seemed to have respected the separation of powers and the democratic ideal of legislative, executive, judiciary branches. So much so that he resigned. So, and you know, I'm a kid of the 70s and 80s. Our big evil man was Reagan, but at least Reagan seemed to honor the idea of the presidency and the fact that we're in a democracy. You know, we always had hope that as bad as that guy in the White House is, at least he seems to respect the idea of we are a democracy and a republic. I'm not sure if that's really going on right now.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, I heard your question a little bit deeper than simply who's at the top. I heard your question about like the systems that, you know, control outside of the government. The government exists, but now, you know, with $100 trillion out of circulation in foreign trusts and all over the world, how does capitalism work if it's not being circulated? So a very small population of people, maybe 2,000-3,000 in the whole world, control 40+% of the, you know, totality of wealth.
Yeah.
So that kind of disproportionate control and power is unfathomable for us mere mortals.
Yeah,
So
agreed.
what do you do with that? It's
like a perfect
part of
storm
that?
of cultural opposition, the government, the global issues. A lot of things that have come together right now create a very unique challenging situation.
So
We're all groping for where we want to input and struggling with, again, on a stage this massive, the role of the individual seems pointless.
So you were going to say something?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like layering on top of our president's disrespect for democracy is the unique challenge of our times is the misinformation. It's
Right.
so.
But the misinformation existed in Thoreau's day. There were Democrat newspapers, there were Whig newspapers.
It did, but
It's not like now, of course, you're right.
yeah, I mean, I grew up in young in the 60s and the 70s and free networks and they reported the news and
Yeah.
I mean.
I think the disinformation is our greatest enemy right now. because it's everywhere. And, you know, as much as I like the fact that I can have Zoom lectures and come out to people across the country, not necessarily sure if social media is a good thing or a bad thing. You know, before I finish though, gosh, this is so depressing. Give me,
Read that again.
give me something good. Yeah, I mean, you know,
You gotta think of it outside our lifetimes.
yeah,
I'm struggling with this same subject with my parents right now, who are generally speaking about all of your age. And my mom has been a spiritual, she's been in the ministry for a long time, her whole life. And even now, she's just struggling hard. And you just gotta think about it outside your lifetime. She's lived a good life, and you're living a good life, and you're paying attention to all that surround you. Continuing to do that. The ripples are 7 generations back and 7 generations to come.
I'm a big believer in putting out the good vibes. Because the good vibes will come back to you to simplify it, you know. I suggest, go home tonight and read Walden. Or better yet, go to Walden. Reconnect with where you find your bliss. I mean, that's what Thoreau did. He talks about going for his walks, but the problem is he's thinking about the stuff going on in the country and it's ruining his walks. And then he had to kind of refocus himself and say, okay, that's there. What business have I being in the woods if I'm thinking of something out of the woods, he would say. And we all kind of have to do that. Focus on you, focus on your loved ones, focus on radiating. Now I'm sounding like, a new age lecturer here, but focus on what's important to you. And hopefully that will help us get over this hump and move on to better things. Are there any more questions? So on behalf of myself and the Thoreau Society, for the people that are here, for the people that are on Zoom, thank you guys so much for joining me this evening. I really appreciate it.